Right, hi everybody. In this video, I'm going to try and complete topic 7.2, and I'm going to cover what the IB syllabus refers to as the debate about climate change. Now, this is the one instance where I really think I disagree with the wording in the syllabus, and I'll try and explain why. And you probably noticed that I've put the word debate in air quotes because my feeling is there isn't really a debate, and if there is, it's manufactured. I don't think it's real. Um, but I'll start by looking at the syllabus, what the syllabus says, and then I'll express my own viewpoint about the things that the syllabus sets out. So this is what the syllabus says. It says we need to look at how there's been a significant debate due to conflicting environmental value systems surrounding the issue of climate change. Now, I think there's two things wrong there. First of all, as I've already said, I think the debate is manufactured and shouldn't really be happening, or I might argue it doesn't really exist. And secondly, if there is a conflict, I don't think it's between different environmental value systems. It's not between technocentric ideals and ecocentric ideals. I think it's between people who believe what the scientists say and people that don't believe what scientists tell us. Right. Secondly, the syllabus says global climate change models are complex and there's a degree of uncertainty regarding their accuracy. That's a statement of fact, and that feeds into the problem that some people have believing the scientific consensus that climate change is real and it will have real effects. And then finally, under applications and skills, it asks us to evaluate contrasting viewpoints on the issue of climate change. Now, to do that, I think that's a first statement. To do that, I want to look at 5 people, and you can see those 5 people in the box above my head. At least 2 of them I think you recognise, probably the first and last. And they are people with quite differing viewpoints about climate change, how we should tackle climate change, or if it even exists. So I'll go through each of those people basically as a guide to 4 or 5 different viewpoints you might have. However, unlike what the syllabus says here, I don't think those different viewpoints are due to different conflicting environmental value systems. We might argue about what technocentric or ecocentric approaches we might use to solve the problem, but I don't think there's a conflict there. I think obviously there will be some ecocentric approaches that work and some technocentric approaches that work, and we need to apply all of those things together. So I think it's an incorrect statement, that first one. Okay, so first of all, like I said, I don't accept there is a debate, but I got this from an old environmental textbook, which kind of went through the problems, maybe not so much debating the issue, but believing that the issue actually exists. All right, so first of all, it's a huge problem on a global scale. Across a long time period, you could argue, at least a few generations. There are natural and anthropogenic or human-made factors that affect climate change. Obviously, human factors have a much greater role to play, I would argue, than natural factors at the moment. We've talked already about positive and negative feedback loops within climate change, and I think I've already made the point in the previous video that they're not well understood. So that makes it a bit more difficult to look at the issue and look at how it might manifest itself in the future. I've already said this, that the processes occur over the long term. It's difficult for humans to look into the future. We are animals that look at short-term gain. And we've already discussed the issue of the tragedy of the commons. The fact that humans look at short-term gain over long-term sustainability for everybody. And certainly the tragedy of the commons applies to global climate change. Many people have vested interests or biases, conscious or unconscious, I've said there. So therefore, certainly in the case of not believing in climate change, there might be many biases which push you to make the decision that it doesn't really exist. We've already mentioned this before. A lot of the evidence is based on climate models which have inherent uncertainty. we have to look into the future with these models, and there's a huge number of variables that have to be inputted, and therefore the outputs have a large degree of uncertainty. When people see that models give answers with large degrees of uncertainty, the tendency is not to believe them, especially when you mix that with the biases that I mentioned previously. Last couple. If we do take action against climate change, it's likely to have huge cost implications, maybe effects on our standards of living. Possibly we might have to accept that. And it might affect a huge number of people. And then finally, a large amount of information is out there. A lot of it is disinformation or misinformation, including the source for that might be some of our leaders at the moment, at this time. And social media as well plays a huge role in spreading misinformation and conspiracy theories. Okay, moving on. This is my main argument, I think, about why I don't think this debate exists. It's something we look at in theory of knowledge, and it's called occurrence law. This guy is Daniel Okrent. He is a journalist. He used to work for the New York Times, and he came up with something called occurrence law, basically because in journalism, in his line of work, he was fed up with basically newspapers especially giving information in a problematically unbalanced way. So he basically made the point that a lot of the media makes a debate when a debate doesn't really exist. And he said that the pursuit of balance creates imbalance because sometimes something is just true, just plain true. And I think that's the case with the debate surrounding climate change. We try to invent this debate so that we can argue about whether climate change exists or it doesn't. But 97 is the figure that's always used. 97% of scientists are actually working on climate change all agree that it exists and it's anthropogenic in nature. So the debate is between 97% of scientists who are actually working on a problem and 3% of scientists, maybe a lot of whom are not working on climate change. And I think it's just a prime candidate for occurrence law, or the fallacy of false balance. Okay, and secondly, I'll put a link, hopefully in this video when I publish it, to somebody who can explain this much better than me. But I wanted to talk about the precautionary principle. And the precautionary principle is a tenet of the scientific method, which basically says if you have a choice of doing something or not doing something, you do a cost-benefit analysis, and if the costs of not doing anything are hugely problematic, then you should do something, regardless of whether you believe that climate change is real or not real. We should do something because the cost of not doing anything and not trying to solve the problem could be catastrophic. I think it goes further than that because there's actually a lot of benefits in trying to introduce laws and methodologies to combat climate change, which I think is kind of summed up quite nicely in this cartoon, which I'm afraid I can't remember exactly where I got it from. But obviously the joke is, what if this is a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? I think that encapsulates the precautionary principle. Okay, so to complete this, what I hope is a fairly short video, I want to look at the viewpoints of these 5 people, which you can see here in box above my head. I think they, again, encapsulate 4 or 5 very different viewpoints about climate change. And in the classroom, you can tell me who you agree with and who you disagree with, as long as you justify your position, please. All right, so number 1, this is Al Gore, former Vice President of Bill Clinton and Democratic presidential candidate in the year 2000. He lost very narrowly to George Bush Jr. that year. He won the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize, along with the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, for his work trying to push education of what climate change is. And you probably known best for his two movies, An Inconvenient Truth and An Inconvenient Sequel. A lot of people pushed back against his viewpoints. He did have some information in his films that was actually technically wrong, I think. He was criticised at the time and subsequently because he's not really a scientist or not a climate scientist. I think he did study geology, I believe, as a undergraduate. But he's probably been one of the main educators over the last 20 years about the dangers of climate change, anthropogenic climate change. Obviously, he believes climate change is real. It's a huge danger for humankind, and we should do something drastic about it. And he's been pushing politicians since he retired from politics after his unsuccessful presidential push to do something about climate change. That's Al Gore. You might not be familiar with this guy. This is Bjorn Lomborg. He's from Denmark. He's an economist, and he calls himself the skeptical environmentalist. He's been quite a prolific writer about the subject of climate change over the last few years. Technically, although he calls himself the skeptical environmentalist, he's not an environmentalist. You might argue he's not qualified to really talk about it. He's qualified to talk about the economics. Possibly he should call himself the skeptical economist. He's somebody who accepts that climate change is real. It's caused by human activity. But his viewpoint is the economy should take precedence over anything we do to try to combat climate change. He believes that it's more important that we invest in our children and they have all of the opportunities we had. And he doesn't believe that attempts to tackle climate change should affect the global economy. He opposes the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Accord. Basically, he's in favour of strengthening our economy because it's more important than the losses we would incur due to trying to tackle climate change. Quite a different viewpoint to Al Gore. Number 4, this is Martin Durkin. He's a UK filmmaker and film producer. And he's most famous, I think, for a film called The Global Warming Swindle, or I think it's called The Great Global Warming Swindle. And his viewpoint is that global warming and climate change is the biggest hoax that's been perpetrated on humankind in recent memory. Basically, he's a conspiracy theorist. He believes that scientists are in league to try to affect the global economy, that scientists have their own agenda. And interestingly, in his film, he came up with this notion, and he was actually supported by a few scientists that he cherry-picked. Again, I mentioned the 3% of scientists versus 97% of climate change scientists. He cherry-picked people with views that agreed with his own. One of the most famous is that he believes that climate change is happening, but it's natural, and because the Earth's climate is changing, that's what's affecting carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. Not that carbon dioxide is affecting temperature, but it's the other way around. I mentioned, maybe it's a good point just to go backwards a little bit. I mentioned that 97% of scientists believe in anthropogenic climate change, and a huge number of not just individual scientists, but scientific authorities and associations have issued declarations to say that they believe and their members believe that climate change is real, it's caused by humankind, and we should do something about it. So I just made a little list before I came online to do this. So famous organisations around the world that have released declarations like this include NASA, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, international academies of science all around the world, including the US Academy of Science and the Royal Society. I noticed that the UK Parliament have done the same thing. The American Physical Society, the American Meteorological Society. There's a huge number. So again, what he's been doing is cherry picking a very small number of scientists that agree with his viewpoints and giving them this falsely balanced argument against the consensus of science. Or again, he's actually showing that Daniel Occurrence law actually exists in practice in the media. Okay, this guy is Nicholas Stern. He's a British banker. He was the former vice president of the World Bank, and he was an advisor to the British government quite a few years ago now. He's most famous for a report that he put out as part of his work for the British government called the Stern Review. And he's an economist who believes that the global economy needs to change, that it needs to become more sustainable, more circular, because that is how we prevent climate change. So unlike Bjorn Lomborg, another economist, he's in favour of trying to change the global economy to try to do something to combat climate change. He's in favour of the work of the United Nations, Kyoto and the Paris Accords, and he's pushing the idea that international agreements or agreements between governments and the United Nations are going to be really necessary to try to combat climate change. Okay, and obviously I'll finish with probably the most famous face of the movement against climate change at the moment, Greta. I know I'm going to pronounce her second name incorrectly if I try. Thunberg, I think that's incorrect. She's probably the person you all know at the moment. She's become the face of activism against governments and trying to force governments to do something about climate change. So she's a Swedish environmental activist. I think she's 18 years old now. She started her activism at the age of 15 by organising a strike at her local school, her own school. And her belief is obviously climate change is real. It exists. It's caused by humans. But her big push is that governments need to take action now. She's become the voice of youth, and her belief is that governments and older people, older generations than her, need to do something because it's her generation that will suffer the most. I don't think she pretends to be she doesn't pretend to be a scientist. I think she's made it obvious she's not qualified to make decisions about the science. What she has said is that scientists are correct, must be trusted, must advise governments, and that governments must do something about it. Obviously, her big push has been to try to get governments and the United Nations to actually take action now against climate change. Okay, and she's a good person to finish this little talk about. So I hope, well, first of all, I hope I'm not trying to push any biases that you think I might possess. My viewpoint is that it's a false debate, if a debate actually exists, that something should be done about climate change very, very rapidly because we're approaching these tipping points where positive feedback will take over. I don't think the IB is correct to say that there's a conflict between people of different environmental value systems. Like I said before, I think the problem exists between people who have different belief systems, not value systems. Okay, I hope that was helpful, and I'll be interested to hear your own views about this in the classroom. So take care, and I will speak to you very soon.